At the end of 1941, as you look at a map of the Eastern Front, everything seems to indicate that Germany is winning. German arrows crisscross Ukraine, advance on Moscow, and cut through the heart of the Soviet Union like a sharp blade. Villages fall one after another. Nazi flags appear on towers, stations, and ruined buildings. To those watching from afar, it is a clean, organized, almost inevitable victory. But what the map doesn't show is the state of the men who make those arrows move. The Wehrmacht had already been engaged in months of relentless combat. Since June, they had marched and fought without rest. Roads covered in dust in the summer now turn into thick mud in the autumn. Trucks get stuck. Horses collapse from exhaustion. Soldiers carry bodies, weapons, equipment, everything on their shoulders, already worn down by fatigue. However, in Berlin, the perspective was different. In the heated halls of the German command, far from the biting wind of the East, officers analyzed optimistic reports. They said the Red Army was broken, that Moscow would fall at any moment, that all it would take was one last push. Hitler believed this blindly, and it wasn't just belief, it was deadly stubbornness. He gave orders: do not retreat, do not give in, do not take a step back. It didn't matter if the troops were freezing. It didn't matter if the lines were stretched too far. It didn't matter that the Soviet winter was already growling in the distance. For him, retreating was a sign of weakness. Victory had become an obsession. In the trenches, the feeling was quite different. The German soldiers saw the first signs of the end of that dream. The wind began to cut their faces like blades. The ground became as hard as stone during the night. Their hands trembled not only from cold, but from exhaustion. Many could no longer feel their toes. Some took off their boots and saw their skin was purple, dead, pieces of their own bodies beginning to give up. So the commanders kept repeating, "This is the last effort. Moscow is right next door." But the truth is that with every kilometer they advanced, they moved further away from their own survival. The illusion of victory was like a fog, thick, deceptive, beautiful from afar, deadly up close. The senior officers still spoke of conquest, glory, and dominion, but in the ranks, the soldiers already sensed something different. They were not marching to victory, they were heading straight for winter, and to death. They thought there was still time. They thought the cold would only be a mild inconvenience, something a disciplined soldier could endure. But the Russian winter doesn't come with warning. He collapses. By the end of October 1941, the ground was no longer mud. It's a frozen swamp. The mud, called by the Germans Rasputitsa, it swallows entire trucks, wheels spinning in vain, engines roaring to death. Horses slip, break their legs, and are abandoned. Cannons get stuck, rendered. Useless, left behind like metal bones scattered along the roads. And then, without asking permission, the cold sets in. It's not an ordinary cold spell, it's a cold that hurts. Temperatures plummet to 30 degrees, 35 degrees, 40 degrees Celsius. It hurts when the air enters the lungs. Each breath becomes an invisible blade, tearing from within. The German soldiers simply weren't prepared. They hadn't been equipped for that. The winter coats never arrived. Many were stuck in warehouses or on trains that couldn't move forward. The Wehrmacht was still wearing autumn uniforms, made for cold winds, not for the white hell of Russia. The boots hardened like stone. The leather was cracking. The sweat froze inside the clothes. Men were starting to lose their fingers. First sensitivity, and then color, and then life. And the worst part, many, they didn't even realize it. During the night, the body simply shut down. Soldiers would sit down for a few minutes to rest, and they never got up again. Frozen. They were still alive when they fell asleep. The weapons were malfunctioning. The oil in the rifles froze. Machine guns jammed in the middle of combat. Tanks, which were steel monsters in the summer, became lifeless blocks in the ice, their engines unable to turn. The German soldiers were trying desperate solutions. They urinated on the gun parts to thaw them. They would light small fires under the vehicle engines, risking everything for a few minutes of operation. But even the fire was overcome by the biting wind. Meanwhile, on the other side, the Soviets were at home. Accustomed to the cold since childhood, they would appear covered in white coats, lined boots and fur hats. Many moved around on skis, gliding through the snow as if they were part of it. They looked like ghosts emerging from the blizzard. And for the Germans, already exhausted, malnourished, trembling uncontrollably, that was more than just an enemy. It was like fighting against winter itself. Each night, the white silence was broken by sounds that no one would forget. The crackling of ice on the branches, the freezing crunching of teeth, the muffled cries of soldiers who could no longer feel their legs. Morale was beginning to crumble. Faith in victory was fading, but the orders remained the same. Advance, resist, do not retreat. But now, the question inside each soldier was no longer, when are we going to win? It was another one, darker, more desperate. Will I survive the next night? Logic dictated that an army planning to conquer half of Europe should be prepared for any weather. But logic has never been a priority in the East. The Wehrmacht believed in a short war, a quick campaign, a Soviet collapse before winter. That's why heavy coats, lined boots, thermal gloves never made it to the front lines. When the cold finally set in, the German soldiers were still wearing lightweight fabric uniforms. They were made for the European autumn, not for Siberia. They had thin coats, worn gloves, and ordinary boots, often already torn from endless marches through the mud. Now imagine this. You are standing in a Russian forest. The snow was hitting his face. The wind blew through his coat as if it were paper. His body trembles uncontrollably, not out of fear, but because of the cold. And it's not a controllable tremor. It's the body collapsing. Their feet witness the first battlefield. Inside the wet boots, the sweat freezes, the skin hardens, the muscles stop responding. Then comes the numbness, and then the pain. A pain that burns like fire, only cold. When the soldier finally took off his boot, he saw his foot was blue, then purple, then black. The flesh is already dead. Many had to amputate right there hastily with improvised saws or heated bayonets. Others simply tied cloths together and moved on until the body falls. The fingers suffered as well. Soldiers held their rifles for hours. When they let go, they simply couldn't move their hands anymore. And the machine gun? He was escaping, it was falling, and it couldn't be recovered because touching the exposed metal was like touching skin to living ice. The beard, the sweat, the tears, everything froze on his face. An ice crust formed around the men. They looked like broken statues walking slowly through the snow. And it wasn't just the body, the spirit froze as well. The German soldier, who had previously marched confidently, now walked in silence. No music, no jokes, without hope. Some began stealing clothes from Soviet corpses. They ripped coats from the dead, boots from fallen men, gloves from frozen companions, not out of cowardice, but driven by survival instinct. Because at that moment, it was no longer about ideology, flags, or glory. It was simple. Either you were protecting yourself from the cold, or he would take you. Many soldiers did not die in combat. They died on their knees, hugging their own bodies, trying to warm their legs, while night descended like a sheet of ice. Frozen alive, eyes still open, faces locked in expressions of astonishment. Meanwhile, the command in Berlin still believed in victory. But on the front lines, every man knew Germany was not only facing the Red Army, I was confronting nature itself, and she doesn't forgive anyone. For weeks, the Germans thought that the cold would also affect the Soviets in the same way. They were wrong, ugly, because while the Wehrmacht froze in silence, the Red Army reorganized in the shadows of winter. Deep within the Soviet Union, far from the reach of German bombers, factories continued to operate in endless shifts. Tanks, rifles, ammunition, everything flowed forward. Entire divisions, trained for combat in extreme conditions, came from Siberia. Men who had known that cold since childhood, who hunted, marched and survived in temperatures that the Germans considered impossible. They were not afraid of winter, they were his children. And then, in December 1941, came the shock. Without warning, without grand pronouncements, like a silent avalanche that starts small and turns into mass death. The Soviets launched a large-scale counteroffensive near Moscow, a meticulously planned attack, waiting for the exact moment when the Germans would be weakest, hungry, exhausted, freezing. Suddenly, from the white forests and misty, icy horizons, figures camouflaged in white emerge, almost invisible in the snow. Soviet soldiers advanced inscissorlant. Light machine guns were transported on makeshift sleds. Artillery camouflaged under sheets of snow was beginning to fire, and the Germans could barely react. With jammed weapons, frozen fingers, scarce ammunition, and shattered morale, positions that once seemed firm became as fragile as glass. The first line fell, then the second one, then came the chaos. Communications began to fail. Cables buried in the snow, frozen radios, messengers killed along the way. Units were caught off guard in the white darkness. No time to organize a defense. Without understanding where the enemy was coming from. By the time they realized it, it was too late. It was close quarters combat. In the middle of the forest, in the middle of villages covered in ice, man against man, bayonets, grenades exploding in the snow, throwing up frozen earth mixed with blood, bodies sinking into the white, leaving dark stains that soon disappeared under more snow, and terror took over. Because the Germans realized something terrible. The enemy they thought was destroyed. It was coming back stronger than ever. And it wasn't just a military counterattack. It was a historic revenge. A brutal response to months of invasion, destruction, and massacre. The Red Army wasn't just fighting. He was pushing the enemy back to the hell he came from, village by village, field by field, with cold blood and determination. And for the first time since the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, one thing began to become clear in the minds of the German soldiers. They were no longer the hunters. Now they were the prey. The collapse of the German lines. Up to that point, the Wehrmacht was still trying to rely on one idea. We are still organized. We are still in control. But control is a fragile thing. And on the Eastern Front, it shattered like glass in the dead of winter. With the Soviet counteroffensive gaining momentum, the German lines, once stretched like a long steel chain, began to stretch too far until they broke. The troops were scattered across hundreds of kilometers. Communications failed. Roads disappeared under meters of snow, and what had once been a continuous front had become a jumble of isolated positions surrounded by an invisible enemy. Some divisions simply ceased to exist as an organized unit. Platoons were losing contact with battalions. The battalions didn't know where the regiments were. Officers disappeared in the blizzard, dead, wounded, or simply swallowed up by the chaos. No radio, no reliable maps, without direction, and in the midst of all this, soldiers are trying to survive. Some were still trying to hold their positions, digging trenches in the frozen ground with their bare hands because the shovels broke in the rock-hard earth. Others built makeshift shelters with damp wood, remnants of destroyed houses, and doors torn from abandoned villages. But nothing was enough. The Soviets advanced in waves. Sometimes it wasn't even a frontal attack. They were silent leaks. Groups emerged from the forests, the flanks, and the backs of the German positions. Suddenly, the enemy would appear from behind, where there should have been safety, and then panic would set in. German soldiers would wake up in the middle of the night to gunfire at close range, shouts in Russian, explosions that lit up the snow like frozen lightning. Many units experienced a psychological breakdown even before a physical one. When they realized they were surrounded, without ammunition, without food, and without hope of rescue, some tried to break through the lines by running into the white darkness, under gunfire, in the cold, in despair. Others simply gave up. A few still resisted, not out of heroism, but because they had no other choice. And in Berlin, the orders were the same. Resist until the last man. No retreat. The position will be maintained at all costs. But the cost could no longer be paid, because the structure no longer existed. Just exhausted men trying to act like an army that was ceasing to exist. In many places, the German lines were not defeated by a major blow. They dissolved, like thin ice under the weight of the Soviet winter. And while the generals were still drawing arrows on heated maps, on the actual front, the arrows turned into tombs, buried under snow and silence. And there, in that collapse, a new reality was born. The war in the East would no longer be a German offensive. It would be a long, bloody, and desperate struggle to avoid being completely swallowed up. The fight against the invisible enemy, hunger. The fire killed in seconds with a flash, and a man could become a torch. The cold wore away the heat in hours, stealing it finger by finger until the heart stopped. But hunger was a patient executioner that crept in little by little, day after day, week after week, and transformed proud soldiers into ghosts who still breathed. When German logistics lines began to collapse, first slowly, then catastrophically, it wasn't just fuel or ammunition that disappeared. It was the very sustenance of life. Trains coming from Poland or Western Ukraine arrived days late, if they arrived at all. The train cars appeared frozen, doors sealed by ice, and inside them boxes of biscuits transformed into solid blocks. Cans of meat burst from the cold, loaves of bread as hard as bricks. Many trains simply never arrived, derailed by partisans, bombed by Soviet aircraft, or abandoned in the middle of the steppe because the locomotive froze. The few trucks that attempted to cross the roads, transformed into frozen mud, got stuck up to their axles. The horses pulled with their last breath and died standing, still tethered to their harnesses. When a train managed to break through, it arrived with a third of its initial cargo. The rest had been stolen by starving soldiers from the transport units themselves, or lost in the snow. On the front lines, official rations have fallen to levels that would be laughable if they weren't so heartbreaking. Inside November 1941, a Wehrmacht soldier was still receiving about 3,600 calories a day. By December, there were fewer than 2,000. In January 1942, in many sectors, the daily ration was 800 to 1,200 calories, sometimes less. In Stalingrad, in the encircled pocket, he consumed 300-400 calories a day for weeks on end. One man burned over 5,000 calories a day just to stay warm at 35 degrees C. The body began to devour itself. First came the fat reserves, then the muscles, finally the organs. The men were losing 20, 30, 40 kilos. Faces that were once full became hollow, eyes sunken, cheekbones protruding like blades. The skin became gray, translucent, and stuck to the bones. His gums were bleeding, and his teeth were starting to fall out. Her hair was falling out in clumps. Scurvy was returning, just as it had in the days of the 17th century navigators. They ate everything. First, the regiment's horses. Thousands were slaughtered. One horse could provide meat for an entire company for 2 or 3 days. Then there were the horses, dead for days, stiff from the cold, cut up with an axe because a knife wouldn't penetrate. They ate stray dogs, cats, crows, and rats. In Stalingrad, soldiers hunted sparrows with their helmets turned upside down, throwing stones. A sparrow would give 3 or 4 pieces. Then came the leather, belts, boots, saddles, pistol holsters. Everything was cut into pieces, boiled for hours until it became a gelatinous paste that barely had any taste, but at least filled the stomach a little. Some would scrape the fur off sheepskin coats and boil the inner leather. Others chewed on strips of raw leather all day long, just to stave off the pain of hunger. Some people who saw the Soviet prisoners in the nearby camps looked at them with a mixture of hatred and envy. At least they received a bowl of hot water soup with leftover cabbage once a day. German soldiers would trade gold watches, Zeiss binoculars, and Lugers for a piece of Soviet black bread. Hunger transformed men. Officers who previously punished indiscipline now turned a blind eye when soldiers stole frozen potatoes from the warehouses. Friendships that had lasted for years were being broken up over a can of meat. There were fights with knives over half a loaf of bread. There were gunshots. In some units, soldiers killed comrades who were hiding food. In other cases, they killed themselves. A shot to the head seemed quicker than dying of hunger. In the field hospitals, doctors saw men arrive who were no longer men. Skeletal bodies, bellies swollen from hunger, the classic hunger edema, legs as thin as sticks, skin covered in wounds that wouldn't heal. Many died not from bullets or shrapnel, but because their hearts simply stopped beating during the night. Others died from minor infections that under normal circumstances would be cured in days. And the worst part, hunger made everything else deadly. A hungry man freezes much faster. A hungry man cannot endure a 10 a.m. march. A hungry man doesn't raise his rifle when the T-34 appears. Hunger didn't leave visible marks like a grenade. It didn't make noise like a Katyusha. She would simply go in, sit next to the soldier in the trench, and wait. And I waited, and he carried it. Nights of terror in the frozen trenches when the sun disappeared, that pale, low sun that barely provided warmth, the real hell began. During the day there was still movement, noise, distraction, sporadic shots, orders shouted, the squeaking of caterpillars from a distant tank. But at night, all that remained was silence, cold, and fear. The German trenches were no longer the organized ditches of France or Poland. They were shallow holes dug in the frozen earth with pickaxes that flew sparks when they hit the ground. Often, these are just depressions in the snow, covered by torn tarpaulins, doors ripped from destroyed houses, or simply snow piled up to form a small wall. Inside them, the men huddled together, shoulder to shoulder, trying to share the almost non-existent body heat. The promised winter coats never arrived in sufficient quantity. Many still wore their summer uniforms with newspapers stuffed inside, or pieces of blankets stolen from burned houses. At night, the temperature dropped drastically. 35 degrees Celsius was common. 46 degrees Celsius was recorded several times. In some areas of the Leningrad front or near Moscow, temperatures reached 250 degrees Celsius. The air burned their lungs. His breath would instantly freeze in his beard, forming crusts of ice that weighed down his face. The eyelashes turned white, their nostrils were pressed together. Any exposed skin would turn white within minutes. The first stage of freezing. Nobody took their boots off at night. Firstly, because I couldn't put them on anymore afterwards. My feet swelled terribly. Secondly, because many already had frozen, black feet, rotting inside their boots. Taking it off meant not being able to walk anymore. Sleep was the greatest enemy. Every soldier knew, if you sleep soundly, you might not wake up. Hypothermia arrived silently. First, the body trembled violently. Then it would stop shaking, a dangerous sign. Then came an irresistible drowsiness, an almost pleasant sensation of warmth. And then the heart would stop. That's why they fought against sleep the way they fought against the Soviets. They took turns staying awake. They were nudging each other. It pinched. He was slapping her. He talked about anything. About home. About women. About hot food. Talk to me, Heinrich. Don't close your eyes. Think about your mother baking a cake. Tell that story about the girl from Munich again. But many couldn't resist. They would sit in a corner, resting their heads on the snow-covered parapet. And by the time his teammates woke up, his body was already stiff, eyes open, covered by a thin layer of ice. He just looked like he was sleeping, but the cold had already won once again. And then came the Soviet patrols. Small groups of men in white coats, their faces painted white, moving like ghosts in the snow, trained to walk without making a sound. They used skis or simply walked on the soft snow without sinking, because they were lighter. They didn't carry the weight of German hunger. They were cutting barbed wire with silent shears. They went into the trenches, they beheaded sentinels, they were throwing grenades inside the shelters, or they would simply disappear, leaving only knives embedded in the backs of those who slept. The Germans listened to things all night long, branches snapping, light footsteps in the snow, a whisper in Russian carried by the wind. Sometimes it was real, sometimes it was the mind breaking down. Many kept their finger on the trigger all night. They were shooting at shadows. They were shooting at each other by mistake. They shouted challenges in the dark, "Wer da?" until their voices were hoarse. Soviet snipers loved full moon nights. The snow reflected the light, transforming the battlefield into an illuminated stage. A German soldier who lit a cigarette, even if concealing it with his hands, would receive a bullet in the head within seconds. And even when there was no attack, even when the night was completely silent, the terror wouldn't go away. Because the enemy wasn't just the Soviet soldier, it was the cold that seeped into his bones. It was hunger gnawing at his empty stomach. It was the fear of closing their eyes. It was a certainty that in that icy darkness, anything could happen, and it usually happened. On the Eastern Front, during that endless winter, the nights were not for rest. They were built to survive, or to die trying. The collapse of German logistics. What made the Wehrmacht seem invincible during the golden years of the Blitzkrieg was a logistics system as finely tuned as a Swiss watch. Standardized trucks, precise trains, advanced depots, and meticulous planning. But in Russia, during the winter of 1941 to 42, that clock simply froze. It all started with trucks. Most of the Heer's vehicles were requisitioned civilian production vehicles, not designed for temperatures below 15°C. The motor oil turned into a viscous paste like hardened honey. The rubber gaskets stiffened and cracked. The batteries were losing charge within hours. To start the engine, the soldiers would light fires of straw or rags soaked in gasoline under the engine block, a dangerous ritual that often ended with the truck in flames. Regular. Rubber tires cracked like glass. Radiators would explode when the water froze and expanded. In December 1941, in some armies more than 50% of the motorized fleet was idle, not because of bombing, but because of the cold. Then came the trains. Deutsche Reichsbahn converted Russian gauges in record time during the advance, but nobody thought about winter. The water in the boilers froze and caused pipes to burst. The air brakes were failing. The track switch points were jammed. The snow accumulated on the tracks in layers up to 2 meters thick, and there weren't enough snowplows. Partisans cut lines at dozens of points every night. A single train carrying winter uniforms was stranded for weeks in Smolensk because the locomotive literally froze in place. The driver found it covered in a 30 centimeters thick layer of ice. And the horses, my God, the horses. The Wehrmacht entered the Soviet Union with over 625,000 horses, more than Napoleon had taken in 1812. They were the backbone of logistics. They hauled cannons, ammunition carts, and field kitchens. But there wasn't enough hay in Russia. The horses received only half the necessary ration, sometimes just straw stolen from burned izbas. They lost weight in weeks. The smooth horseshoes slipped on the ice. Horses would fall, break legs, and be put down on the spot. In January 1942, Army Group Center lost 180,000 horses in 3 months. Soldiers found animals frozen, standing upright, still harnessed, their eyes glazed, their snouts covered in ice crystals, like grotesque statues in the middle of the road. The fuel has become liquid gold. The German army needed 1.3 million tons of supplies per month just to maintain its advance. In December, he received less than 300,000. The tanks would run out of diesel and be abandoned with their cannons pointed backward as if ashamed. The Luftwaffe, which was supposed to compensate with airlifts, lost hundreds of Ju-52s on frozen runways or shot down by Soviet fighters that were now flying in conditions that the Germans could not withstand. And what about the winter uniforms? Nearly 2 million padded coats, felt boots, gloves, and hats with ear protectors were promised. Some of it was stored in warehouses in Warsaw because there were no trains. Part of it was sent too late. Some of it was stolen by rear units who lived better than those at the front. Soldiers on the front lines cut up captured Soviet blankets, wrapped newspapers around their bodies, and stuffed straw into their boots. Many fought with their bare hands because gloves were traded for food with Hiwis or prisoners. Logistics didn't collapse all at once. It crumbled kilometer by kilometer, day after day, train after train missed. At one point, a soldier from the 2nd Panzer Army wrote in his diary, "Yesterday we received 14 boxes of ammunition for 88mm cannons and 400 boxes of French vodka cognac captured in 1940. Today a truck arrived carrying typewriter ribbons and carbon paper. We are fighting the Russians with carbon paper." The German war machine, which had conquered Europe in months, died not with a bang, but with a chilling screech. Engines that wouldn't start, tracks that wouldn't carry anything, horses that wouldn't walk, men who wouldn't eat. The snow fell over everything and covered the wreckage like a heavy, white, final shroud. Hitler forbids any retreat. In Wolfschanze, the hidden headquarters in the forests of East Prussia, Hitler paced back and forth in front of maps, his eyes bloodshot, shouting that not an inch will be given. For him, war was still colored lines, arrows, symbols. For the soldiers on the front lines, they were just numbers that had to be obeyed. In December 1941, when the Red Army launched its counteroffensive on Moscow, dozens of generals requested permission to retreat to shorter, better supplied defensive positions. The answer was always the same. 9. Guderian personally flew to Rastenburg to plead with the 2nd Panzer Army to retreat 100 kilometers. Hitler fired him on the spot. Höppner, commander of the 4th Panzer Group, retreated without orders to save his men. He was dismissed, expelled from the army, lost his pension and his right to wear a uniform. Von Bock, von Lieb, von Rundstedt, all the big names from the East were sidelined or dismissed for health reasons, for suggesting flexibility. A ordem tornosi dogma. Every company holds out until the last man. Each company fights until the last man. Surrounded. Positions were to be transformed into Festungen, fortresses. Kolm, Demyansk, Milerovo, Rzev, Stalingrad afterwards, all received the same order: resist, resist, resist. Insufficient air supplies, out of ammunition, no food, hopeless. In Demyansk, 100,000 men were surrounded from February to April 1942. They received an average of 200 tons of supplies per day, when the minimum required was 600. Luftwaffe pilots flew through snowstorms, dying by the hundreds trying to drop sacks that often fell on Soviet lines. German soldiers hunted for the sacks amidst enemy fire as if they were gold. A frozen loaf of bread dropped from an airplane broke teeth when bitten into. But Hitler called it a victory of the will. On the front lines, the order not to retreat turned into pure madness. Units were ordered to hold villages that were already surrounded on 3 sides. Soldiers were forced to counterattack in waist-deep snow without tank support, which lacked fuel, and without air support, which lacked aircraft. Anyone who retreated without orders was shot on the spot by Feldgendarmerie officers with metal plates in their chest. There were firing squads behind the lines just for that. Some officers disobeyed in secret. They saved their men by retreating at night without informing Berlin. Most people didn't dare, so they stayed, buried in the snow up to their chests, eating horses that have been dead for days, cutting pieces of leather from boots to boil, watching the T-34s approach slowly, as if they had all the time in the world. Letters arrived in Berlin telling the naked truth. We are being exterminated on orders from above. Hitler would order them to reply, "Hold on, the Führer trusts you." In a position near Rzev, a lieutenant wrote in his diary before killing himself, "We do not die for our country. We die because a Bohemian corporal is afraid of losing prestige." The order not to retreat was not a strategy. It was pride. It was fear of admitting a mistake. It was a man in Berlin refusing to accept that he had lost control, and because of this, hundreds of thousands of German soldiers did not die in battle. They died because they couldn't escape it. They froze in positions that no longer had tactical value. They drowned in snow that reached their necks. They were crushed in pockets that Hitler insisted on calling impregnable fortresses. The winter of 1941-42 did not only defeat the German army, he shattered the myth of the Führer's infallibility, but the price was paid with the frozen blood of an entire generation of young Germans who in the end had nowhere else to go. Not even forward, because there was the Red Army. Not even backwards, because there was Hitler. So they stayed there, in the middle of the White Steppe, waiting for the end they already knew was coming. And it came. He always came. Battles in the snow, man against man. The war on the Eastern Front was no longer the mechanical symphony of yesteryear. The coordinated roar of hundreds of panzer tanks, the thunder of the Luftwaffe tearing through the skies, the divisions advancing in perfect arrows on the staff maps. Now everything has shrunk. It shrank until it became something microscopic, dirty, visceral. A backyard fight, a bedroom fight, a hallway fight, with a knife to the throat, a bayonet in the belly, and teeth sunk into the jugular vein. The Russian villages, those wooden and mud brick collectivi with names that nobody could pronounce, correctly became the new decisive battlefields. A single Isbar could cost 50, 100, 200 lives. The Germans arrived first, exhausted and frozen, and occupied the houses while they were still warm. They ripped doors off their hinges to fuel the oven. They piled Soviet corpses in the windows like sacks of sand. They made holes in the frozen mud walls to insert the MG-42's barrel. The smell inside the house was a hellish mixture: gunpowder, frozen sweat, dysentery feces, burnt flesh of those who got too close to the fire. Everyone wanted to stand near the oven. That's why they fought over him like dogs. The sergeant decided who would stay closest, usually the favorites, or those who still had bullets to exchange. The others cowered in the corners, trembling so much that their teeth chattered like machine guns. Then came the Soviets, without warning, without a preparatory dam, just silence. And suddenly the front door exploded with a burst of PPSH, or the back. Window was broken open with a boot, or a cable grenade would roll across the floor like a possessed tin can. The fighting inside the house lasted for minutes, sometimes seconds. On the ground floor, Germans who were sleeping with their boots on woke up to find Soviets already on top of them. Shots fired at point-blank range. The bang inside the enclosed space was so loud it ruptured eardrums. The flash from the muzzles of the rifles illuminated faces for fractions of a second, the faces of 18-year-old boys with the eyes of old men. Rifles were useless at those distances. The Karabiner 98K was almost 1.20 meters long, impossible to maneuver in a 2-meter corridor. Then came the weapons of despair, a folding trench shovel, sharp as a cleaver. A downward blow split the skull open from shoulder to waist. The soldiers proudly recounted how many Russians they had killed with their shovels. 5 heads in a single house in Cholm, 7 in one night in Zhev. The bayonet driven upwards, under the chin, entering through the roof of the mouth to the brain. Luger or Walter P38 pistols, used as a makeshift solution when they ran out of bullets. Egg grenades, small, perfect for throwing upstairs or under doors. There were houses where the fighting lasted for hours, floor by floor. The Soviets occupied the ground floor, the Germans kept the attic. Grenades went up and down. Bodies were rolling down the stairs. The floor was so slippery with blood and brains that no one could stand. Up. When one side finally won, the survivors emerged covered in the blood of others, their eyes glazed, unable to speak for days. In the wine cellars, it was worse. Total darkness. The smell of rotten potatoes and slowly decomposing corpses. Fighting blindly. Feeling your way around walls, sensing the enemy's breath before suddenly, Finnish knives cutting throats. bare hands squeezing until the neck bone cracked. A soldier from the Spanish Blue Division said he killed a Russian by biting. His carotid artery, warm blood, was the warmest thing he had felt in weeks. In the forests, combat turned into primitive hunting. The snow was chest deep. Walking meant clearing a path with the body, leaving a furrow like a tank. Reconnaissance patrols turned into ambushes that lasted for hours. Soviet snipers were demons. Women like Lyudmila Pavlichenko, Alia Moldagulova, or the infamous night witches. No, those were pilots, but the snipers were worse. They would lie motionless in the snow for days on end, with only their eyes uncovered. They ate snow so they wouldn't have to pee. They defecated in their pants so they wouldn't have to move. They expected a German to raise his head an inch. A single shot, only one dead. Then they would change position, crawling like worms. The Germans called them white rabbits or ghosts. In Leningrad, a single sniper killed 309 confirmed Germans, many with a shot to the forehead from 800 meters away in the snow with winds of 30 km/h. When two patrols met in the forest, there was no surrender. They fired until the magazines were empty. Then they advanced in silence, bayonets fixed. The silence was broken only by the sound of metal going into flesh, of bones breaking, of blood gurgling on the snow. A survivor from the 32nd Infantry Division wrote, "We found 41 bodies in a clearing, 23 of ours, 18 Russians, all killed with bladed weapons. One of our corporals still had the Russian's thumb between his teeth. The Russian still had the knife embedded in the eye of the handle. They were frozen like that, embraced like lovers." In another village near Vyazma, a single house changed hands 7 times in one night. The Germans captured it 7 times. The Soviets retook it 7 times. The following morning, 180 people were found dead within an area of 80 square meters. The ground was so littered with bodies that you had to step on them to walk. And always, the snow covered everything in hours. The bodies disappeared beneath the white. The pools of blood turned to black ice. The screams echoed in the survivors' heads for weeks, because in that war waged from village to village, from house to house, from room to room, there was no strategy. Pure animal survival. It's simply the instinct to kill before being killed. And each day, the survivors realized a horrifying truth. It didn't matter who got the house. It didn't matter who got the village. By the end of the night, there were just fewer men left alive. And the snow always won, covering the bodies, erasing the tracks, preparing a clean stage for the next massacre. The body breaks first. Everyone knew that. But the mind breaks down more slowly. And when it breaks completely. Initially, it was the newcomers who crumbled. The 17-year-old boys who still believed in the Wochenschau advertisements. Then it was the veterans' turn. Those who survived Poland, France, and the Balkans. Those who laughed at the war in 1940. Now they wept, clutching their rifles like children with teddy bears. The collapse began slowly. First, the gaze changed. It was fixed in place, glazed, as if he were seeing something beyond the white horizon, something that only he could see. Then came the conversations with the dead. "Mom! Mom! I'm cold!" A sergeant from the 18th Panzer Division was found talking to his own helmet, calling it Liesel, the name of his 4-year-old daughter whom he has never met. Another soldier, a Latin teacher from Munich, recited Virgil aloud during the Katyusha bombings, as if the eclogues could protect from hell. The hallucinations were the worst. Soldiers saw entire cities shrouded in snow, warm lights, fogged windows, the smell of grilled sausage. They walked towards them and were shot down like ducks. Others heard church bells, Christmas music, the girlfriend's voice calling his name. An entire platoon near Kalinin followed a hot light in the forest during the night. They walked 3 kilometers, waist-deep snow. They were found frozen in a circle, holding hands, smiling, as if they had finally arrived home. Either I am a great traitor, When they managed to sleep, 15 minutes here, 20 there, they would wake up screaming. They always dreamed the same thing. They were at home. The mother served cake. The wife opened the door with the baby in her arms. And then the ground would open up and they would fall back into the snow. They would wake up crying, and many decided it's better never to sleep again. They spent nights sitting, eyes open, counting snowflakes, or by counting your own heartbeats, or counting the dead they carried in their memory. Self-harm has become routine. It wasn't cowardice. It was cold, hard calculation. A self-inflicted wound to the left foot, always the left, so it doesn't seem intentional. Or place your hand on the railing until it freezes completely. Or accidentally letting a grenade without a pinroll inside the shelter. The field doctors stopped. Investigating, they would simply cut off the frozen limb and send the man back. A surgeon from the 6th Army wrote in his diary, "Today, I operated on 27 feet. 26 was self-inflicted. Number 27 was mine, but I didn't have the courage." Suicide is no longer an exception. It became the solution. A gunshot to the head during the early morning shift. Nobody asked. They simply wrote, "Killed by the enemy." Others walked towards the snow. Simply, they would leave their rifles leaning against the trench, take off their helmets and walk away. They were found weeks later, sitting against trees, arms crossed, faces serene, as if they had finally found peace. In some companies, the phenomenon had a name: White Walkers. Officials reported that the men stopped reacting. A Soviet patrol entered the trench, beheaded 3 sentries, and the others watched. They didn't raise the alarm. They wouldn't pick up a rifle. They just stared, as if they were no longer there. A military chaplain wrote, "A letter that was never sent. These men no longer have souls. The eyes are dead, the body still moves by reflex, but the soul has long since frozen. We bury them alive every day." In February 1942, in some sectors of the front, 30–40% of the casualties were psychiatric. Men who were trembling uncontrollably, even though they weren't cold. They would wet their pants when they heard a branch snap. They would curl up in a fetal position during bombings and never come out again. They were evacuated with an official diagnosis of frostbeulen, frostbite. But everyone knew the truth. The Russian winter didn't just kill the German body. He killed faith in the Führer. It killed the belief in victory. It killed hope. He killed what made them human. Those who returned, the very few who did, carried that look with them. The gaze of someone who has already died once. Years later, in 1955, 1965, and 1975, they were still waking up screaming at 3 in the morning. They could still see snow when they closed their eyes. They could still hear the dead calling out their names, because some never actually left Russia. They're still there, sitting in a trench that no longer exists, hoping someone will come and pick them up. But nobody ever came. Where once there was vibrant life, women singing while washing clothes in the frozen river, old men smoking pipes sitting on wooden benches, children chasing chickens, the smell of fresh bread rising from ovens heated by brick kilns. Now, there remains only an emptiness that hurts more than any wound. The small Soviet villages, scattered like lost seeds across the endless steppes, became deadly traps. Houses made of thick logs creak and groan under the weight of the accumulated snow. Roofs collapse with dull thuds in the middle of the night, burying entire families while they sleep. Walls are blackened with soot from fires that no one put out, because there was no water, only ice. Windows shatter from the extreme cold or from shrapnel from grenades. Doors hang crooked on their hinges, banging in the wind like loose bones. The smell is constant: burnt wood, rotten meat, frozen human feces, gunpowder, a scent that clings to clothes, skin, and soul. Civilians are stranded in the middle of nowhere, with nowhere to go. The Germans arrive first. They occupy the houses, expelling the families to the barn or to the street. Younger women disappear at night. The able-bodied men are dragged to dig trenches, carry ammunition, clear roads, all at gunpoint. Many are shot as partisans simply because they had an old radio or a machete in their kitchen. Then the Soviets counterattack, and then the village turns into hell twice over. The families who survived the Germans are now suspected of collaborating. Men hanged from lampposts for giving bread to starving German soldiers. Women shaved and branded as traitors. Orphaned children given to whoever wants to take them. In the midst of all this, most people are just trying not to die. Old people and children hide in cellars dug into the earth, which is as hard as stone. Damp basements where moisture freezes on the walls, forming sharp crystals. Where fat rats gnaw on the fingers of the dead before the living even notice. Where the air is so thin that candles go out and people faint. Down there they can hear everything. Heavy footsteps on the ground above, German boots. Then silence. Then came lightweight, almost silent boots, Soviet style. Shouts in German, shouts in Russian. Explosions that make the earth tremble and dust fall on the children's faces. A mother covering her baby's mouth to prevent him from crying and telling everyone. The food runs out in days. First they eat the potatoes stored in the cellar. Then the peels, then the shoe leather was boiled until it turned into a paste. Dogs and cats disappear. Slaughtered at night, eaten raw so as not to produce smoke. Dead horses found in the street are fought over with knives. There are reports of families who ate live rats because they didn't have the strength to cook. Children with bellies swollen from hunger, eyes too big for small faces, translucent skin showing blue veins. Mothers breastfeeding babies who no longer have milk, only dirty, melted water in their mouths. When the fighting reaches the village, there is no escape. Houses become machine gun nests. An entire family is burned to death when the Germans set fire to the Isba, a type of dwelling, to flush out Soviet. Snipers hiding in the attic. Another family is shot in the basement by the Soviets because they found a can of German meat. Children are hit by stray bullets that pass through walls as thin as paper. A 7-year-old girl is found frozen, sitting in the snow. A rag doll in her hand, her eyes open, looking at the sky, as if waiting for her mother to return from the river. Elderly people who are unable to escape are used as human shields, tied to the front of tanks, or simply shot so they wouldn't eat. When the village finally falls one way or the other, the silence that follows is worse than the gunshots. The silence was broken only by the wind howling through the empty windows, the cracking of frozen wood, and the distant barking of a dog that no one feeds anymore. Bodies remain where they fell. A woman with the baby still in her arms, the two frozen together in a grotesque embrace pose. A child with their head blown apart by shrapnel, the toy still in their hand. Old men sat on benches, heads bowed as if they were merely taking an eternal nap. The snow covers it all with a clean, white, deceptive layer. Within a few hours, the village appears untouched, as if nothing had happened. But those who pass by there weeks later find only ghosts. Burned houses with bullet holes in the walls, furniture overturned, family photos torn apart in the snow. Broken toys, an empty cradle rocking in the wind, and sometimes, very rarely, a survivor, a child hiding in a cold oven, an old woman who ate snow for weeks. Eyes that have seen everything and now see nothing. These villages were not destroyed solely by war, they were deleted. Names that still appear on military maps, but that no longer exist in the real world. Places where life was suspended forever that winter, where the cold didn't just kill bodies, it killed memories, it killed futures, it killed the very idea of home. The Wehrmacht that entered the Soviet Union in June 1941 was a perfect war machine, complete. Divisions, tanks gleaming in the sun, soldiers singing marches, officers confident they would be in Moscow before the leaves fell. 6 months later, that machine is broken, creaking, falling apart piece by piece like a slowly decomposing body. The divisions that had 15,000 to 18,000 men in June now barely reach 4,000 to 5,000 in January. Some are shadows. The 18th Panzer Infantry Division, for example, began with 17,000 men. In February 1942, it had fewer than 3,200 active combatants. Rommel's 7th Panzer Division in the east, reduced to a few dozen operational tanks. Entire regiments disappear from the maps, not because they were annihilated all at once, but because they evaporated in the snow. A platoon here, a company there, men frozen, starving, deserted, dead from typhus, gangrene, a stray bullet, a shot to the back of the neck from a comrade who could no longer bear to see them suffer. What remains is terrifying. Men who look old at 22, hollow faces, eyes as sunken as black holes, beards encrusted with ice, uniforms patched with captured Soviet blankets, pieces of carpet, newspapers stuffed inside to try and insulate against the bone-chilling cold. They no longer march. They drag their feet, destroyed boots, wrapped in rags, straw, and pieces of horsehide. Many walk barefoot inside burlap sacks because their boots have been cut up to eat the leather. Companies that should have 120, 150 men have 20, 15, sometimes 8. An officer writes, "I command a company of 11 men. Yesterday there were 12 of us. The hierarchy dissolves. Officers die first. Priority targets for snipers. 20-year-old lieutenants command battalions. Sergeants take command of regiments. Soldiers obey because they no longer have the strength to disobey, not because they believe. Discipline becomes a distant memory. Mass desertions. Men who simply walked backwards at night, surrendering to the Soviets just to have hot soup. Others kill themselves. Others kill officers who insist on carrying out suicidal orders. During retreats, when finally authorized too late, the army becomes a horde. Broken columns dragging themselves through the snow under constant attack from partisans and Soviet aircraft. The wounded are carried in the doorways of izbas, on the hoods of burned-out trucks, in makeshift sleds pulled by men who can barely stand. Many are left behind, not because of a cruel decision, but because there is no choice. A comrade with black, gangrenous, frozen legs, begging, "Don't leave me." And the others look, lower their heads, and continue on. Some receive the coup de grace from a comrade. Others are left screaming in the snow until their voices fail. This weight remains. Soldiers who survived have carried those cries for 70 years. They no longer talk about victory. In the trenches at night, when the cold allows them to talk, they only speak of hot food, of home, of women, or they don't say anything. They stare at the tiny fire, faces illuminated by faint flames, eyes dead. They no longer sing marches. They sing sad songs softly with hoarse voices, or they cry in silence. The Wehrmacht is no longer being defeated only by the Soviets. It is self-destructing. Men who once marched proudly now steal food from each other. They kill for a piece of bread. They give up on life because their bodies no longer obey their will. The myth of German invincibility, the one that terrorized Europe, is cracking like thin ice under heavy boots. In February 1942, the High Command received reports that it dared not show to Hitler. Some divisions have combat strength below 50%. Others no longer respond to the radio. They've simply disappeared into the snow. The perfect machine of 1940 became an army of ghosts in 1942. Men who can still walk, but are already dead inside. And the worst part, they know. They know that the war is over for them right there, in the Russian snow. The 1,000-year Reich lasted 6 months against the backdrop of winter. All that's left is to postpone the inevitable. A soldier wrote in a letter that was later burned and found decades later, "We are no longer soldiers. We are meat that winter is slowly eating away at." And it was true. That winter of 1941-42, the Wehrmacht was not only brought to a standstill, it was undone, piece by piece, soul for soul, until only the frozen shell remains of an army that once believed itself invincible. It wasn't Soviet bullets that killed the most people. It wasn't the T-34s crushing the trenches. It wasn't the Katyushas howling like demons in the sky. The greatest executioner of that winter wore a white, invisible cloak and didn't fire a single shot. It was the Russian winter itself, a winter that knew no truce, no pity, no end. In December 1941, the temperature dropped to 30 degrees. 35 degrees Celsius was routine. In January 1942, temperatures reached 42 degrees, 48 degrees, and even 52 degrees in some areas near Moscow and Leningrad. It was a cold that couldn't be measured by thermometers, because the thermometers broke. It was a cold that changed the very physics of the world. The air was burning. Each breath was like inhaling shards of ground glass. The lungs contracted, ached, and felt like they were bleeding from the inside. His exhalation turned into a dense cloud that instantly froze on his beard, mustache, and eyebrows, forming heavy crusts of ice that cracked the skin with the slightest movement. The exposed skin turned white within minutes, then gray, then black. Superficial frostbite, then deep frostbite, then gangrene, all within hours. Soldiers who removed their gloves for 30 seconds to pull the trigger lost their fingers. Literally, their fingers would turn black, stiff as wood, and fall out of their sleeves days later whenever someone bumped into them. The feet were worse. Standard German boots, thin leather, smooth sole, were useless below, tendergy. The moisture from the sweat froze inside them. Their feet would swell, then freeze into solid blocks. Many could no longer remove their boots. They had to cut them off with a bayonet, and when they cut them open, they saw the fingers, black, rotting while still alive. Gas gangrene spread within days. Field surgeons were amputating legs with meat saws, without sufficient anesthesia, by lamplight, while the patients screamed or simply stared at the frozen ceiling. Men died standing up. They would sit down to rest for 5 minutes in the snow and never get up again. They were found days later, leaning against a tree, rifle between their legs, eyes open and covered by a thin layer of ice, expressions serene, as if they had only dozed off. Others froze in motion. Walking in column, a soldier would stumble, fall to his knees, and remain there. His companions passed by him, knowing that stopping meant dying with him. Hours later, the body was stiff, covered by a thin layer of snow, like a white statue in the middle of the road. Inside the trenches, the cold was even more brutal. The walls of frozen earth turned into blocks of ice that reflected the meager heat from the tiny fires. The snow leaked from above, melted with body heat, soaked clothes, and refroze at night. A vicious cycle. Men would wake up stuck to the ground, their backs pressed against the ice as if stitched together. They tried to make fire with green wood, with furniture from huts, with family photos found in the houses. But the wind, that Siberian wind that cut like a knife, erased everything. They would light cigarettes by cupping their hands, and even then, the flame would die out before igniting the tobacco. The body betrayed it slowly. First, it stopped shaking, the most dangerous sign. Then came a sweet, almost pleasurable drowsiness, an illusory feeling of warmth. Men took off their coats and boots, lay down in the snow, smiling, and so they died, naked from the waist up, their faces happy in the frozen hell. The Soviets knew this enemy from birth. They grew up with him. Did you know that you should rub snow on frozen skin, never direct heat? Did you know that you should sleep with your boots inside your sleeping bag to prevent them from freezing? They wore felt valenki, sheepskin touloupes, and padded coats that made them look like bears. For them, winter was a cruel brother, but a brother of the family. To the Germans, he was an alien executioner. They weren't ready. They had no clothes. They had no body fat to burn. They had no experience. So they died by the thousands, not in battle, but in silence. December 1941, 25,000 cases of frostbite in Army Group Center alone. January 1942, another 40,000. February, the total number of deaths from cold exceeded 100,000, more than all the bullets and shrapnel combined up to that point. Many were evacuated, mutilated forever, without fingers, without feet, without a nose, without ears. Others simply disappeared. They became part of the white landscape, sitting in the snow, hugging their knees, waiting for a train that never came, an officer who never ordered a retreat, a spring that was months away. Winter takes no prisoners. He didn't give out medals. She didn't write letters to her mothers. He simply covered everything with his white cloak, clean and indifferent. And he kept killing, day after day, night after night, until the Wehrmacht, that invincible machine of 1940, became nothing more than a pile of frozen bodies scattered across the steppe. Because there, on the Eastern Front, the war was not won by the Red Army alone. She was defeated by General Winter, and he never lost a battle, never, not even once. When spring finally arrived, timid, dirty, treacherous, in March and April of 1942, the snow began to recede like a wounded animal licking its own wounds before dying. But what she revealed was not hope. It was pure horror. The black mud of the Rasputitsa swallowed everything. Boots, wheels, corpses. Fields that were once roads have become swamps of half-thawed, swollen bodies, purple and black faces emerging from the melting snow like rotten fruit from a macabre harvest. German trenches, painstakingly dug during the winter, were now open mass graves. Hundreds of thousands of bodies piled up, some still in combat positions, rifles frozen in bony hands, open eyes covered by a milky film, mouths gaping open in screams that no one else heard. Villages that once had names were now just marks on the map. Piles of charred logs, solitary chimneys pointing toward the grey sky. Bones of horses and men mixed in the mud. The smell was unbearable. Rotten meat, thawed feces, old gunpowder. Fat crows pecked at eyes that no longer blinked. Rats the size of cats scurried among the wreckage. And it was there, in that disgusting thaw, that the world saw the truth. The Wehrmacht had not only been stopped, it had been broken. That winter of 1941-42 cost Germany more than 1 million men, dead, seriously wounded, frozen, missing, almost a third of the entire force on the Eastern Front. Entire divisions no longer exist. Tanks that cost a fortune have become rusty scrap metal in the mud. Horses, hundreds of thousands, rotted in the fields, swollen like balloons. And the worst part, the myth is dead. Until then, the German army was synonymous with invincible terror. Poland in weeks, France in months, the Balkans, Norway, Greece, it all collapsed like a house of cards. The soldiers marched singing, convinced that they were a superior race, that war was an exact science that they had mastered. But in Russia, winter taught them something different. The blitzkrieg died in the snow. Speed turned into stillness. Precision turned into chaos. Trust turned into deep, corrosive doubt. After Moscow, after Stalingrad the following year, the Wehrmacht never again attacked with the same fervor. The offensives of 1942 and 1943, Kursk, Blau, were already desperate attempts by a wounded man trying to get up, but feeling his legs broken. The initiative passed to the Soviets. Forever, the generals knew. Von Manstein, Guderian, Paulus, they all saw in the soldiers' eyes that something had been broken forever. Hitler fired dozens of them, but he couldn't fire reality. The army that once obeyed blindly now obeyed out of fear, inertia, and lack of alternatives. The survivors of that winter carried the mark forever, on their bodies, amputated fingers that could never again hold a cup of coffee without pain. Reconstructed feet that limped on damp days, cold-burned lungs that coughed up blood until the age of 80. Many returned home, the few who did return, with eyes that did not return. They didn't speak, or when they spoke, it was in whispers. You don't understand. You weren't there. You didn't feel it. Entire families have learned not to ask. Wives slept next to men who woke up screaming at 3 a.m., covered in sweat, calling out for companions who had died decades ago. Children grew up watching their parents gaze at the snow through the window as if they were seeing ghosts. Some never truly returned. They remained in Russia, not in official cemeteries, but in anonymous graves, in fields, in forests, their names engraved on cold memorials or simply forgotten. For the Soviet Union, that winter became legendary. The winter that saved Moscow, the winter that showed that fascists bleed, freeze, and die like any other man. It became songs, movies, school books, Ni shagu nazad, not one step back, but in reality, winter gave the push. But The real lesson wasn't one of victory, it was priced. The price of the arrogance of believing that one can conquer a country the size of a continent in a few months. The price of underestimating a people who have already faced Napoleon, Charles the Feetoothed, the Tartars, and survived. The price of believing machines will win when nature decides otherwise. Because there, on the frozen steppes, winter didn't choose sides. It killed Russians too, hundreds of thousands of civilians, poorly equipped soldiers, in the first few months. But the Russians knew their executioner. They knew how to dance with him, not the Germans. And they paid. They paid with frozen blood, with broken souls, with a Reich that was meant to last 1,000 years, but began to die there, little by little, in the snow. When the war ended in 1945, the Western Allies found German soldiers who still trembled at the memory of that winter. Old generals, during interrogations, wept when talking about December 1941, because that wasn't just one winter. It was the beginning of the end, the moment when history took a turn, the moment the world realized that Nazism was not invincible, that he was only human, fragile, mortal, and the snow preserved that lesson. He buried her under layers of white, but she never truly melted. It's still there. For those who know how to listen to the silence of the Russian steppes in winter, you can still hear the screams. You can still feel the cold. It's still understandable. No empire survives when nature decides that the time has come.